Here we are again with another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Again, another solo one. The primary aim of these solo ones being to take things that I notice within maybe the world at large, but obviously specifically within the osteopathic profession, to add details into the conversation that I see that may not necessarily be present currently and might be helpful. So this time, what I'm going to attempt to do is use the concept of critical thinking as an example or an exemplar of something that I was trying to point to previously when I was trying to show through standard osteopathic textbooks that osteopathy is primarily a profession that prefers ideas, right? It prefers a constructivist viewpoint, or a viewpoint that would hold that truth or knowledge is dependent on the individual, the previous experience of the individual, and the environment of observation. So that's kind of generally the way that seems to go. And one of the easiest ways to show that within osteopathy, as I did in the previous iteration of this, or in when I did this, is to show that in the standard osteopathic textbooks, there's a preference for the concept of philosophy, or that which can be developed as a thought or an idea without empirical evidence. So it generally essentially lacks experimentation. So the idea is supreme over the material reality or over the shared reality. Now, the reason that I want to invoke the concept of critical thinking is because in most fields or in most professions, or in education in general, you will often hear the common refrain of, you have to be a critical thinker, or something that I've heard throughout my lifespan is, well, they don't teach critical thinking anymore, something along those lines. Now, what I'm going to show you is that critical thinking isn't necessarily an actual observable thing in a complete sense. There are ways to operationalize it so that you can observe some things, but it's more an idea than a thing, if that makes at least some degree of sense. And I'll try to do that with what I show you. So critical thinking, I'm going to share my screen here for those who can see it and for those who can't. Hopefully I do a decent job of appropriately describing what's here. So resize this screen for those who are watching, not necessarily for those who are listening. This may not work as well as I want it to, but yeah, that actually should do okay. So yes, so what we're looking at here is, this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And if you look up critical thinking, or if you Google critical thinking John Dewey, then you will start to be pointed in the direction of what I'll take you through. So John Dewey was an American philosopher, and approximately in 1910, he introduced in writing this concept of critical thinking. So I'm going to read an excerpt from this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, just so that you hear this in somebody else's words, and then I will make commentary. So this supplement elaborates on the history of the articulation, promotion, and adoption of critical thinking as an educational goal. Okay, so you see right away with that statement, it's an educational goal, not necessarily an observable phenomenon. So the next line, or the next paragraph, reads, John Dewey, 1910, page 7482. That's a book that he wrote. So continuing with the quote, introduced the term critical thinking as the name of an educational goal, which he identified with a scientific attitude of mind. More commonly, he called the goal reflective thought, reflective thinking, reflection, or just thought or thinking. He described his books as written for two purposes. The first was to help people appreciate the kinship of children's native curiosity, fertile imagination, and love of experimental inquiry to the scientific attitude. The second was to help people consider how recognizing this kinship in educational practice, quote, would make for individual happiness and the reduction of social waste, end quote. He notes that the ideas in the book obtained correctness in a laboratory school in Chicago. Okay, so just to look at what was said there, it was an educational goal. It was a scientific, or a state of mind associated with the science, or a scientific attitude of mind, is how it's said here. So it's a goal. It's not necessarily something that's observed. This goal relates heavily to something he observed as curious children. You'll also note that he didn't always call it critical thinking. And if you read further in this particular entry, you see specific times at which he actually refined, or how he refined the concept of critical thinking to what he called reflective thinking. So he didn't use critical thinking for a particularly long time. He switched it over after experimentation to call it reflective thinking. You will see reflective thinking in more modern psychological literature. You will see also metacognition, or the ability to think about thinking, the ability to think about your thought process. And that is a concept that has debate over it. So it's not necessarily a firm concept. There is discussion and disagreement about the concept of metacognition, or the ability to think about thinking. So now we'll move over to another resource, right? And this is a book by the gentleman's name is Robert H. Ennis, right? So this is a chapter in a book. It says Critical Thinking, A Streamlined Conception by Robert H. Ennis. Now, Robert H. Ennis is a person who has utilized the concept of critical thinking and tried to define it in varying ways and done some work on it more recently, or in more recent history. So there is definitely a preference within him for this term. So you can agree with him or disagree with him, but what presents here is essentially confirmation of the fact, or the observation, that John Dewey was the originator of this term. He changed it to reflective thinking, and Ennis seems to prefer it maybe even more, the term critical thinking, even more than Dewey did. Okay, so I'm going to read an excerpt from here. Beginnings. Critical thinking under that name was inspired by pragmatic philosopher John Dewey in 1910, and endorsed by analytic philosopher Max Black in 1946. Dewey was revered by the progressive educators who relabeled his reflective thinking as critical thinking, a name I believe they originated that persists to the present. See Aiken 1942 for a mixture of both terms. Black 1946, insofar as I can determine, wrote the first college text including the words critical thinking in the title. Next paragraph. But critical thinking did not assume extensive prominence until the early 1980s. The California State University system, in its Executive Order 338, Harmon 1980, required that all students study critical thinking in order to graduate from its units. The Commission on the Humanities, Rockefeller Commission, asserted the Department of Education should define critical thinking as one of the basic skills that provides the foundation for advanced skills of all kinds. There is not enough space here to report the many other strong expressions of support for critical thinking since then, see Ennis 2011, but I should mention the rapid development of interest in critical thinking worldwide since the 1970s. Also especially noteworthy is the support for critical thinking from both major US political parties in the form of statements by two presidents, George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama. Critical thinking was an explicit express goal in America 2000. This is from 1991. An education policy statement endorsed in its preface by then President Bush, President Obama, in his State of the Union Address 2014, listed critical thinking as one of the 6 basic goals of education. So you can see that there's a flip between the term critical thinking and reflective thinking. So Dewey starts with critical thinking, then calls it reflective thinking, then other people return to calling it critical thinking. There are institutional policies that outline critical thinking as a goal. So again, you see it's a bit of an educational goal, not necessarily an observable thing with what's written here. The basis of that policy might have been operationalization of the concept in a particular way, not necessarily just as an idea, but in relation to measurable behaviors or measurable outcomes. Okay, so the idea here, or at least from this excerpt, is to show you that there is a history for the term that doesn't necessarily immediately or explicitly include something that's observable, but it might. Okay, so we move to another document here. Now, this is from Pearson, which is apparently the global leader in education and education technology, provides innovative print and digital education materials for pre-K through college student information systems and learning management systems, blah, 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 blah. So this is a research report for a company that is interested in selling educational resources to places that will provide education. Okay, so it's a literature review. So it looks at a bunch of stuff around critical thinking and then synthesizes it to report. So I will go into this document. So So I'll read an excerpt from here. So I'll read a few excerpts from here so that you get some grounding in this concept. Educators have long been aware of the importance of critical thinking skills as an outcome of student learning. More recently, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills has identified critical thinking as one of several learning and innovation skills necessary to prepare students for postsecondary education and the workforce. In addition, newly created Common Core state standards reflect critical thinking as a cross-disciplinary skill vital for college and employment. Despite widespread recognition of its importance, there's a notable lack of consensus regarding the definition of critical thinking. So I'm going to pull away from the quote for a moment here. That is a very important statement. Critical thinking is something that is said as a goal, but there is not agreement on what it is. Okay, so I'm going to go back into the quote. The purposes of this literature review are to A, explore the ways in which critical thinking has been defined by researchers, B, investigate how critical thinking develops, C, learn how teachers can encourage the development of critical thinking skills in their students, and D, review best practices in assessing critical thinking skills. Okay, so I'll continue with the quote here or continue with reading from this resource. Theoretical background. The literature on critical thinking has roots in two primary academic disciplines, philosophy and psychology. Sternberg has also noted a third critical thinking strand within the field of education. These separate academic strands have developed different approaches to defining critical thinking that reflect their respective concerns. Each of these approaches is explored more fully below. So immediately from this, you identify that there's at least three dominant categories in which critical thinking can be considered, or three large categories, not dominant, but large. Okay. So I'm going to pull from the philosophical and the psychological approaches, not so much the educational, because that will more or less demonstrate how this is functioning, or how the concept or the term critical thinking is operationalized in some ways, and the differences between the approaches. All right. So I'm going to read again the philosophical approach. The writings of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and more recently Matthew Lipman and Richard Paul exemplify the philosophical approach. This approach focuses on the hypothetical critical thinker, enumerating the qualities and characteristics of this person rather than the behaviors or actions the critical thinker can perform. Sternberg has noted that this school of thought approaches the critical thinker as an ideal type, focusing on what people are capable of doing under the best of circumstances. Accordingly, Richard Paul discusses critical thinking in the context of perfections of thought. This preoccupation with the ideal critical thinker is evident in the American Philosophical Association's consensus portrait of the ideal critical thinker as someone who is inquisitive in nature, open-minded, flexible, fair-minded, has a desire to be well-informed, understands diverse viewpoints, and is willing to suspend judgment and consider the perspectives. So these all sound like really cool ideas, but they're just ideas. So at least within the literature that was reviewed for this report and the synthesis of the author, the suggestion here is that there's an ideal approach, or an approach that is an idea, which ontologically or in the study of reality would suggest that they think ideas are the most real thing. And that is not necessarily strange within the realm of philosophy or informal philosophy. And it notes here in the preceding that we read that it's an ideal hypothetical person, not necessarily something that can be observed that the person can perform. Okay, and that's important as essentially looking forward to what you're going to identify when I read the excerpt about the psychological approach to critical thinking. Scroll down a little bit. Again, to read from this, the cognitive psychological approach contrasts with a philosophical approach in two ways. First, cognitive psychologists, particularly those immersed in the behaviorist tradition and the experimental research paradigm, tend to focus on how people actually think versus how they could or should think under ideal circumstances, or conditions rather. Second, rather than defining critical thinking by pointing to characteristics of the ideal critical thinking or enumerating criteria or standards of good thought, those working in cognitive psychology tend to define critical thinking by the types of actions or behaviors critical thinkers can do. Typically, this approach to defining critical thinking includes a list of skills or procedures performed by critical thinkers. To continue reading, philosophers have often criticized this latter aspect of the cognitive psychological approach as being reductionist, reducing a complex orchestration of knowledge and skills onto a collection of disconnected steps or procedures. For example, Balin in 2002 argues that this is a fundamental misconception or that it is a fundamental misconception to view critical thinking as a series of discrete steps or skills, that this misconception stems from the behaviorist need to define constructs in ways that are directly observable. According to this argument, because the actual process of thought is unobservable, cognitive psychologists have tended to focus on the products of such thought, behaviors, or overt skills, e.g., analysis, interpretation, formulating good questions. Other philosophers have also cautioned against confusing the activity of critical thinking with its component skills, arguing that critical thinking is more than simply the sum of its parts. Indeed, a few proponents of the philosophical tradition have pointed out that it is possible to simply go through the motions or proceed through the steps of critical thinking without actually engaging in critical thought. Okay, so you see the critique of the cognitive psychology approach. Now, the critique of the cognitive psychology approach, insofar as you are unable to observe a thought, is absolutely legitimate. You cannot observe a thought, at least with today's skills, abilities, technologies. You can observe the output of a thought. Now, the output of thought could be a physical motion, it could be a set of words, it could be written ideas, it can be a lot of things, but there's a thought and there's an output. So there's a stimulus and there's an output, but the output will intone what had to occur in between the stimulus and the output. Now, the stimulus could be a novel problem. The stimulus could be a test question. The stimulus could be a movement problem. The stimulus could be a motor task. So there could be a lot of stimuli, right? So you can observe the stimulus and then you can observe the output. That is legitimate critique, and then you are generating inference based on appropriate experimentation. So what you have is ontologically the idealists, the philosophers, and the philosophical approach to critical thinking saying it's this ideal thing, or hypothetically good thing, or good set of things that interact in a way that we can't directly observe, which is legitimate, versus the cognitive psychological approach. Like, well, if we can't actually observe it, and it's this thing that you have as an ideal, well, let's observe its output, right? So the cognitive psychologist would be considered more of a positivist or post-positivist who would believe that there is an observable reality or a singular reality that can be identified with appropriate experimentation. Now, they have to acknowledge that the actual expression of that singular reality will be different individual to individual, right? So this is why you're testing a lot of people to see what's relatively stable. So that individual reality is still somewhat abstract in certain cases, or expressed differently between individuals. So you're trying to create an abstract thing that would predict a bunch of, would relatively reasonably predict outcomes. So you have a dispute with respect to critical thinking, generally between a positivist and a constructivist, right? Now, that is essentially what I have noted as what is occurring within osteopathy as a profession. Osteopathy as a profession prefers a constructivist viewpoint and has challenges when those individuals who are interested attempt to use a scientific method to explore the claims of osteopathy, and then the results maybe aren't things that the professionals like, and then they say things along the lines of, well, it's too reductionist. Science can't prove osteopathy. It's just not possible, right? It's not something that can be directly observed. It's not about motion. It's about these other things. So you can see where this conflict occurs. And I want to show that this conflict doesn't necessarily only occur in osteopathy. It occurs in a lot of places, and it is relatively well described through the philosophy of science, through the term ontology, or the study of reality, through the term epistemology, or a theory of knowledge, or the study of knowledge. So you're trying to answer questions such as what can be known, who can it be known by, and how can it be known? I also want to use critical thinking as a term, as an exemplar of how a term comes from a particular location, goes through time, gets used different ways, gets studied different ways, gets questioned different ways. And it's used in a colloquial sense, and it's used in a technical sense. And there's disagreement on the technical side. So you have the philosopher side and the cognitive psychology side. You also have the educational side. Now, what I'll add as commentary is that when you attempt to study critical thinking within the cognitive psychology realm, you essentially don't see it. What you really see is that it is exhibited, like all the characteristics that can be identified and measured in the cognitive psychology approach generally show up in experts, and they generally show up in a very narrow band of their expertise. They don't necessarily show up outside of that. Now, what you will actually see, as for argument's sake, is generalists. So you can have people who are generalists within a discipline or within a field. you would see those generalists do really good at synthesizing information because that's their primary expertise, taking disparate information and putting it together. So you can then make that argument. It's like, well, maybe we need to make more generalists, and then maybe the generalist is the best example of critical thinking. So you can talk about that. Another way to look at this that is actually relatively stable, at least for the purposes of education, and for the purposes of which would extend to the purposes of learning and the purposes of a moving from novice to expert, is if you look at transfer paradigms. So the classical transfer paradigm is what's called a sequestered problem-solving paradigm, such that you're trying to have somebody learn a piece of information in one setting and apply it in a somewhat different setting, either superficially different or very, very, very different. So like lightly different or very different. So you have near transfer, which is sort of different, and far transfer, which is very different. And the idea is that you want them to reproduce the performance or reproduce the skill with no external aid. And when you do it that way, what you tend to see is near transfer can happen in novices to some degree. Far transfer really doesn't. Far transfer happens in experts because the general explanation is that the experts have more ability and skill developed over time of dealing with novelty and dealing with uncertainty and having no choice but to pull things together. So really what you can suggest based on those pieces of information is that critical thinking is a highlight of expertise. It's a way to describe expertise. Now, if you're only studying critical thinking, you maybe won't come to that conclusion. But if you're also having exposure to the concepts of educational transfer, near transfer, far transfer, and you can see that stuff, and you can see the problems with measuring that, the problems with the approach to that, and the good things and the bad things about that, you tend to generally come to expertise as a highlight. So an expert can do a good job of pulling disparate information together in uncertain or novel circumstances, especially within their realm of expertise. As I noted, a generalist can do that, and it looks like they maybe have better critical thinking, but the reason is because they have a general skill set or a skill set that isn't at the expert level within a particular place. It's just good at synthesizing information. So what I would say is that in a functional sense, for those involved in clinical decision making, for those involved in the profession of osteopathy or other healthcare professions, a transfer paradigm is often going to be quite useful for educating the next generation and for preparing a current or future clinician to move from novice to expert, because it's comparatively easy to operationalize as opposed to this term critical thinking, which might be an actual thing, might not be. There's an argument about that, as I noted, between philosophers and cognitive psychologists. So it might be a thing, it might not be a thing. The output might be important, or it may be too reductionist, depending on who you prefer or whose argument you prefer. But if you are attempting to do something that is practical and help yourself move from novice to expert or help somebody else move from novice to expert, a transfer view, an educational transfer view might be important. And then you can actually optimize for transfer. So if you want to optimize for far transfer, one of the findings is that if it's a procedural skill set, near transfer is not terrible. But if it is something that would be considered a deep feature or a framework concept or a principled concept, you can use different terms, but something that is non-tangible. So an idea that would guide behavior, problem solving skills, the ability to identify, causal links in plots, problem solving frameworks. So when I say problem solving skills, you could say problem solving frameworks. That could be a diagnostic approach, right? Because it's non-tangible, it's harder to identify, right? So you can't see it, you can't really touch it. What you have to do to promote that, which is especially important for far transfer, is you explicitly note the framework, you explicitly note the principle, you explicitly note the heuristic, and provide a minimum of 2 concrete examples of what it would look like. So now that people have examples of behaviors that relate to the framework, so you can optimize for far transfer. It's not perfect, it does take time, it is much more evident in experts, but you can kind of goose the process. So my general point here with highlighting this in the conversation is that I've also heard the concept of osteopathic thinking. There's a way to think osteopathically. There's really no evidence that would ever bear that out. The discussion around critical thinking could be the same discussion that you would have if you actually tried to dig deep into osteopathic thinking. It's really not. It's either an idea that somebody prefers, or it's something that would be observable with output behavior, and the output behavior would just match the arc of novice to expert, or the progression from novice to expert. So we already have frameworks that do a much better job of describing what this would look like, either in an observable way that has clear output, or in a way that it's just an idea and it's a preference, and we can pontificate and be real jerks and say that one person has it, another person doesn't, because I really know what osteopathy is, and I know what osteopathic thinking is, and it's a philosophy. You could do all that. But what I would say is that we have really good frameworks for working through that concept. You can prefer it as an idea, so you can be an idealist about it. You can be a constructivist about it and say that it's really about the individual, their previous experience, and their environment of observation. And essentially, you could make the argument that that's how you would develop an expert, but the way that you develop an expert is much more concrete. They have to be a novice first in some way, shape, or form. You have to teach them some things. If you're trying to teach them a framework and a quote unquote a way to think, which really would be well described as a framework or a heuristic setup or a diagnostic approach, you then can also use the educational term of scaffolding. So you give them kind of a rough outline, and then you put details on it, and then they can put more details on it with experience, right? So you can make the argument from a constructivist side, but from a more operational viewpoint, you need to give a framework, and you need to give details, and then you need to assess whether or not they're progressing through that skill set as an output side, because osteopathic treatment really is an output thing, and the patient is the end user. So if you want to optimize that, or optimize for moving from novice to expert, then a transfer paradigm, an educational view of how you generate a novice or move a novice towards the direction of expertise, then a transfer framework would probably work better. So again, critical thinking acts as an exemplar of the difference between a positivist and a constructivist, between a philosopher and an actual operationalized psychologist, between philosophy and science, right? So you can see that there's just different ways to view this. Both have their merits, or all rather have their merits. They all have their limits as well. So use them for their merits. Do your best to avoid their limits. If you're attempting to improve the delivery of education, then optimize in a transfer framework, especially a FAR transfer framework, because that's going to do at least something to help the movement from novice to expertise. Osteopathic education works, but there are likely ways to do it better. And hopefully within these discussions that I provide as a solo discussion, and with the discussions that I'll provide in the future with other people as essentially conversation partners, we can highlight that and show how there's ways to do it better. One of the highlights of looking at teaching research or education research is that bad teaching shows pretty good improvements. So you can have identifiably bad teachers teaching learners, and learners will still improve. So what I'm hoping to suggest is there's no need to rely on the fact that students are really the ones that do all the work. They're going to do the work anyways, but there's ways to improve the teaching process so that it's better for the instructor, it's better for the students overall. So I'm not saying that osteopathic education as it stands doesn't work. It obviously works because you get functional practitioners. I'm saying it could be better, and I'm hoping to inject into the conversation the ways that it could be better. So hopefully that was useful, and I'll talk to you soon.